I can still feel the cold tile under my palms from that morning, the air thick with steam and the scent of someone else's perfume lingering where it never should have been. My heart didn't just drop. It folded in on itself as the truth settled over me in a way I couldn't unsee. If you've ever had a moment where the world tilts under your feet, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from, because what I walked into that day still echoes inside me. I remember locking the bathroom door with hands that were steadier than my breath, knowing instinct alone had carried me to the one place I was never meant to find. That was the moment everything started to unravel. I knew something was wrong the moment I stepped into that quiet hallway. There was a rhythm in the air that didn't belong there, a sound that made my stomach tighten before I even reached the cracked bathroom door. When I pushed it open, the truth hit me so fast it felt like the floor shifted under my feet. There they were, my son's girlfriend and the man she always introduced as her trusted advisor, entangled in a way that erased any question about what had been happening behind his back. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. It wasn't just the betrayal I was witnessing. It was the realization of how deeply my son had trusted her, how much of himself he had handed over believing she cared for him. That thought hurt more than anything in front of me. Instinct took over before I had time to think. I reached back, shut the bathroom door, and turned the lock with a quiet click, sealing them inside. My hands were trembling, but my voice was steady in my own head as I grabbed my phone. I knew I had to protect my son from walking blindly into this. I also knew her husband deserved to know what had been unraveling behind his family's walls. I made both calls with a controlled calm I didn't recognize, standing in that narrow hallway like it was the last solid ground I had. And as I waited for the inevitable storm to arrive, everything inside me began to rewind, pulling me back to how this morning had even begun. That morning, before everything shattered, my heart was in a completely different place. I had woken up thinking I would surprise my son with a small brunch to celebrate the promotion he had worked so hard for. He had been rebuilding his life after a rough season, and seeing him stand taller again filled me with a kind of quiet pride only a mother truly understands. I wanted to show up early, set everything on the table, and remind him how far he had come. His girlfriend was part of that picture, at least on the surface. She seemed supportive enough, always talking about how much she believed in him, and the advisor she introduced him to carried himself like someone who wanted the best for him. Still, there were moments when something inside me tugged, warning me that their presence felt a little too rehearsed, a little too polished. I pushed those thoughts aside, telling myself I was being overprotective. Walking into his house that morning, though, that unease brushed up against me again. The place felt different, like it was holding its breath. I told myself it was just the quiet of arriving earlier than usual, but deep down I knew it was the same feeling I had ignored more than once. As I carried the groceries into the kitchen, I kept thinking back on little things that hadn't made sense at the time. Tiny shifts in my son's behavior, strange confidence his girlfriend seemed to have about decisions that weren't hers to make. I dismissed them back then, but they were already lining up in my mind, waiting to be seen clearly. And after what I witnessed in that hallway, those early hints finally began forming the red flags I should have paid attention to. Looking back, the signs were there long before that morning. It's painful to admit how many of them I brushed aside because I wanted so badly to believe my son had finally found stability. At first, it was small things. He became guarded in ways he never used to be, offering vague explanations for decisions he once would have talked through with me. I chalked it up to wanting independence, but deep down, something about the shift felt unnatural. Then there was the way his girlfriend inserted herself into every part of his life, almost as if she was managing him instead of loving him. She carried an odd confidence when she spoke about his finances, and the advisor always hovered nearby, acting more like a gatekeeper than a professional. Their presence together created a tension I couldn't quite define, but I felt it every time I visited. The real jolt came one afternoon when I happened to see a financial document on his counter. It wasn't the numbers that bothered me. It was the tone of the recommendations, as if someone had convinced him to take risks completely out of character for him. I remember feeling a chill, telling myself I was imagining things, that I needed to trust the process and give him space. But those scattered moments never left me. They clung to me in quiet hours, piecing themselves together into something that resembled a warning I didn't want to face. I kept hoping I was wrong, that my instincts were just overprotectiveness. Standing in that hallway earlier, staring at the truth I could no longer ignore, every red flag I had dismissed came rushing back. And that was when the present finally caught up with all the things I refused to see, pulling me straight into the moment where everything was about to collide. I snapped back to the present the moment I stepped onto the porch, the cold air settling over me like a reminder that there was no turning back. My body was still, but inside everything churned, anger held in place by a thin layer of control, fear sharpening itself into resolve. I could still feel the shock of what I had seen, but now it lived under a steady, focused calm. The house behind me was silent. Almost too silent, as if it knew what was coming. Then I heard the first car pull up, its tires grinding against the gravel. A moment later, another engine approached, heavier, faster, carrying a man who deserved the truth just as much as my son did. I stood there, waiting, listening to doors slam and footsteps closing in. Every instinct told me the next few minutes would change everything. And as they walked toward the house, I knew the confrontation was about to begin. The moment we stepped inside, the sounds from upstairs were still echoing faintly, a cruel reminder of what waited at the top of the staircase. My son froze first. I watched the confusion ripple through him, then horror, as the truth shaped itself in his mind without needing explanation. Beside him, the other spouse staggered back a step, the kind of devastation that empties a person from the inside out settling over his face. I wanted to shield them both, but there was no soft way to do what came next. I guided them into the kitchen, away from the hallway, away from the door I had locked, and placed the financial papers on the counter. Pages I had gathered in shaking hands earlier now lay flat between us. Statements, transfers, recommendations that never aligned with my son's cautious nature. They both leaned in, searching for something that made sense. Instead, what they found was a trail of depletion. My son's savings, carefully built over years, were nearly drained. Investments he never would have chosen had been pushed through under the advisor's direction. The other spouse's accounts showed the same pattern, slow siphoning, just subtle enough to hide behind affectionate reassurances and feigned expertise. As the weight of it all registered, I felt something inside me tear for my son. Watching him try to hold himself together broke me in ways I didn't show. He kept asking how this could have happened, though the words came out only as fragmented breaths. And beneath all of it, beneath the humiliation of the affair, beneath the shock of the missing money, there was a quiet realization that they had never been loved, only used, standing there. I felt my own grief harden into something steadier. The betrayal was bigger than infidelity. It was deliberate, calculated harm. And as we gathered ourselves in that kitchen, I knew this was no longer just about confronting two unfaithful people. It was about uncovering who had orchestrated the entire scheme hovering behind them. I thought the worst had already happened, but the knock on the door proved how little we understood. Two investigators stepped inside with an FBI agent close behind them, their presence firm and solemn. They had been tracking patterns of financial exploitation across several states, and the names tied to those patterns had led them straight to my son's house. Hearing that felt like the floor shifted again, only this time the fall went much deeper. They laid out evidence on the same kitchen counter where our shock still lingered. Surveillance images, transaction maps, and reports showed a coordinated network built on emotional manipulation and financial control. It wasn't just my son and the other spouse who had been targeted. There were families scattered across different cities telling the same story. Trust gained, boundaries erased, accounts drained. Seeing the scope of it made the room feel smaller, as if the air itself tightened with the weight of what we were learning. Cole and Brittany weren't acting alone. They were part of a structure, each role carefully designed. The advisor funneled victims toward risky decisions, while the romantic partner built dependence and softened resistance. Every document the investigators showed revealed a new layer of coordination. What we thought was personal betrayal had been a blueprint repeated again and again. My son stared at the images, his face pale, the enormity settling into him in slow, painful waves. The other spouse looked equally hollow, as if he had been pulled into someone else's nightmare, and all I could feel was an expanding protectiveness, something fierce and unwavering. This wasn't just about heartbreak anymore. It was about stopping people who had perfected the art of dismantling lives. As the investigators explained how the ring operated, a thought flickered through me, an intuition I couldn't yet name. Something about the faces, the patterns, the timing. And in that moment, I realized there was one connection no one else had made yet, one thread that would lead directly to the masterminds themselves. When the investigators pulled up the surveillance footage showing the person orchestrating everything, I felt an immediate jolt run through me. The face wasn't unfamiliar. It carried a calm confidence, the same unsettling poise I had seen years earlier at my late husband's memorial service. Back then, I had assumed he was just another acquaintance offering a brief condolence. I remembered the way he studied the room, how his attention lingered on my son longer than seemed natural. I brushed it off in my grief, thinking I was imagining it. Seeing him now, connected to this network, snapped everything into place with a force that made my chest tighten. This hadn't been random. My family had been noticed long before any of us realized we were vulnerable. It was a predator's patience, the kind that waits for openings, watching for the moment a family starts to rebuild and letting trust become the weapon. The violation felt deeper than anything I had processed so far. It meant the people who hurt my son weren't improvising. They were following a plan shaped by someone who had marked us years before. Yet beneath the shock, something steadier rose in me, a resolve that grew sharper with every frame of that footage. If I was the only one who had ever met him face to face, then I held something no one else did. And for the first time all day, I knew exactly what my next step had to be. The weight of recognizing the mastermind settled heavily on me, heavier than anything I had carried that day. It wasn't just the shock of the connection. It was the realization that this man had been near my family long before any of us knew we were in danger. That thought lit something inside me. Fear at first, then a sharper, more deliberate kind of resolve. I remember standing there, watching the investigators sort through evidence and feeling a clarity I hadn't felt in hours. If I was the only one who had ever met him face to face, then I held a piece of this puzzle no one else could offer. It wasn't bravery, not really. It was the instinct that rises in a parent when danger circles too close. Protecting my son meant stepping forward, even if my voice trembled on the inside. When I told the agents I was willing to help, It came out steady, shaped by everything I had witnessed. They looked at me with the seriousness of people who understood the risks better than I did, and in their silence I could feel the weight of what I was volunteering for. Still, I didn't waver. Control had been taken from us for too long, and this was my chance to take some of it back. The preparation that followed felt surreal. They walked me through safety measures, quiet signals, controlled environments. I listened carefully, absorbing every instruction while my mind balanced fear and determination. The thought of facing the mastermind again unsettled me, but there was no part of me that regretted the decision. By the time they outlined the plan, I felt myself leaning into the moment, ready for whatever came next. And when they told me where the meeting would happen, I knew the next step would take place in that small cafe where everything would come to a head. I arrived at the cafe early, letting the quiet hum of morning settle around me. The agents were already in place, though none of them looked like law enforcement. They blended into the space so seamlessly that, if I hadn't been briefed, I never would have known I was surrounded. I took a seat by the window, feeling every heartbeat echo a reminder of why I was there. My hands rested on the table, steady enough, but inside there was a tight coil of fear fighting with a deeper, calmer purpose. When the door opened and he walked in, the air shifted. The mastermind carried himself with the same detached confidence I remembered from years earlier. He sat across from me, his expression softening into rehearsed familiarity. I could almost feel the subtle pull of manipulation he relied on, the gentle pressure meant to lower defenses. But now that I knew who he was and what he had done, his tactics felt transparent. As he spoke, I listened only to the shape of his tone, the calculated pauses, the charm designed to mask control. Inside, I dissected every layer of his facade, seeing the cruelty and precision behind the calm exterior. I let him believe he still held influence, even as I quietly traced the pattern of lies that had ensnared my son and so many others. Then came the signal, small, barely noticeable, but unmistakable. In a single breath, the atmosphere changed. Agents who moments before were sipping coffee rose in coordinated motion. The mastermind's confidence cracked as hands reached for him, and the room erupted into ordered command. I sat still, watching the man who had once studied my grieving family now being pulled into accountability. Relief washed through me, not triumphant, but grounding. The danger was no longer circling us. As they guided him out, I realized the hardest part was finally behind me, and the long path toward healing had already begun. When the cafe door closed behind the agents, I felt a wave of relief so deep it seemed to settle into my bones. The danger that had hovered over us for months finally lifted, but in its place came a quiet exhaustion. I had been holding my breath without realizing it, bracing for every worst possibility, and now the release left me almost weightless. In the weeks that followed, life slowly found its rhythm again. My son moved through the early days in a daze, but with support from investigators and financial specialists, his accounts were restored. Watching him regain confidence felt like witnessing someone come back to themselves piece by piece. The other spouse found similar footing, both of them learning they were stronger than the people who tried to break them. Cole, Brittany, and the mastermind all faced sentencing. Restitution was ordered, and for the first time, accountability felt real. But the healing that mattered most wasn't legal. It was internal. It was the way my son began trusting his own judgment again, the way our home felt lighter, the way I felt myself standing taller after months of fear. This experience reshaped us. It reminded me how fragile life can feel, yet how much strength we carry without knowing it. And as the dust settled, I found myself reflecting on the lessons woven through it all, ready to share the truth I hoped might help someone else. Looking back now, I can see how far my family and I have come from those dark, uncertain days. We learned hard lessons about intuition, trust, and the strength it takes to stand up when everything feels like it is falling apart. I found a courage inside myself that I did not know I had, and I watched my son rebuild his life with a resilience that still humbles me. If you are facing something heavy in your own world, I hope our story reminds you that clarity does return and healing does unfold, even if slowly. You deserve safety, truth, and peace. Thank you for spending this time with me. If any part of this journey resonated with you, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you found value here, feel free to like and share so others can find it too.